In the winter of 1768, a young King Christian VII went on a grand tour of Europe. Standard royal business, visits, ceremonies, the kind of diplomatic theater that courts had staged for centuries. He was accompanied, among others, by a doctor from the small town of Altona, who wasn't supposed to amount to anything. Politically, within 2 years, that doctor would be signing state decrees. What followed wasn't a rebellion. It didn't happen in public. Most people never even noticed it happening at all. That's what made it work. Denmark, the second half of the 18th century. Christian VII was barely 19 when the crown was placed on his head. He lived under a permanent microscope, trusted by almost no one. Who mattered? His image appeared on coins. His seal closed official documents. His name traveled across the correspondence of an entire realm, carried into rooms he would never enter, read by people who would never meet him. But Christian VII was not governing Denmark. He held the throne, but holding power and directing it had begun to drift apart. The people who spent real time with him, not in formal audiences, but in the unguarded hours, saw what the public could not. He was unpredictable. Some days, he seemed almost ordinary, curious, capable of warmth. Other days, he recoiled from everything, from conversation, from paperwork, from the quiet rituals that kept a court functional. Those around him had learned to read his moods the way you learn to read weather before a long journey. Not because you trust the forecast, but because being wrong carries consequences. The work of governance increasingly shifted around him, guided by those who could navigate his unpredictability without triggering it. That gap between the man who held authority and the people who needed decisions to move was where everything that followed began. He arrived not as a minister, not as a noble. Struensee was a town physician from Altona, a minor port city near Hamburg. He wasn't supposed to be there at all. He arrived in the king's orbit almost by accident, which meant most of the court barely registered him. What medicine gave Struensee was something no title could purchase: access. He saw the king without ceremony. He was present in the hours when Christian was not performing kingship, when he was simply existing within it, exhausted or agitated, or caught somewhere in between. Struensee had heard the complaints that never reached ministers. He witnessed the confusion that official papers were carefully designed to conceal, and he understood, perhaps before anyone else put it into words, that Christian's condition had created instability at the center of power, not an empty throne, but a function. Others were increasingly learning to direct. He rarely gave instruction directly, and phrased decisions as if they had already been agreed upon. He made himself useful in ways that gradually became indispensable. A conversation calmed before it became an outburst. A recommendation positioned not as a command, but as the obvious, sensible, already settled next step. Christian, who was weary of contradiction and exhausted by judgment, found in him something the court rarely offered. A man who seemed to ease the burden rather than add to it. What began as quiet access did not remain quiet for long. But that wasn't the real problem. Not yet. Because elsewhere in the palace, another situation was developing, one that would eventually intersect with Struensee's in ways neither of them fully planned. Queen Caroline Matilda was living a different kind of isolation, and she was queen. She was the mother of the heir. Her rank was indisputable, her presence required at every significant occasion. People watched her constantly. Her posture at state dinners, her expression during ceremony, what she wore and how she moved and whether she seemed composed. She was studied the way objects of great value are studied, with attention that has nothing to do with care. But she was not consulted. She was not trusted. She was not in the room when real decisions happened. She had arrived in Denmark as a royal bride, young from a foreign court, and discovered that marriage, Even royal marriage rarely meant partnership. She sat beside a king. She occupied the most prominent female position in the kingdom. And still, she remained peripheral to everything that actually mattered. What began as isolation slowly became something else. An awareness that she could shape what she had been excluded from. When she began talking properly with Struensee, not in ceremony, but in genuine conversation, she found what the court had withheld from her for years. He did not speak to her as a rank to be managed, or a status to be carefully navigated. He spoke to her as someone capable of understanding what was wrong with the system around her, capable of having opinions worth hearing. This sounds simple. It was, in fact, extraordinary. Trust built between them the way it always does, between people who find in each other what the world around them has refused to provide. It was not manufactured. It was not strategic at its root, though it would become strategic in its consequences. It began, as most genuinely consequential alliances do, with one person recognizing another as fully human. At the edges of all this, in rooms that were watched less carefully, another figure was beginning to understand that something was shifting, and Juliana Maria was the king's stepmother, but she held no formal power. She was not the queen, nor was she part of the governing structure in any official sense. But she had been at court long enough to understand the difference between being seen and being effective. She was patient, genuinely, unusually patient. She attended dinners, received visitors, wrote letters, asked questions in conversation, never accusations, always curiosity. Who had drafted this recommendation? Why had that official fallen from favor so suddenly? When had the physician begun speaking as though he understood affairs of state? Questions do something that commands cannot. They allow others to arrive at conclusions themselves. They give people the sensation of their own thinking, which means they believe what they've concluded more firmly than if someone had simply told them. She was beginning to understand that something was shifting, and that it might be possible to shape it. These private choices, Struensee's quiet accumulation of access, Caroline Matilda's decision to trust, Juliana's methodical observation, did not look like history in the making. They looked like personal decisions, family dynamics, the ordinary interior life of a court where people were doing what people always do, trying to survive, to be heard, to matter. But small decisions made in private rooms carry weight precisely because no one watches them closely enough to intervene. The consequences were only beginning. Here is the thing about private influence that makes it quietly dangerous. It doesn't announce itself. When Struensee's reach began extending beyond the king's private rooms and into actual governance, it did not happen through a coup. There was no declaration, no moment anyone could clearly point to afterward and say, "There, that was when everything changed." It happened the way a current changes a river. You incrementally, persistently, without drama, until one day you look around and the landscape no longer resembles what it was. Documents that once passed through the Geheime Conseil, the Council of State that had dominated Danish politics for decades, began arriving already prepared, already organized, already decided, waiting only for the king's signature. Men who had spent decades building their positions, their relationships, their understanding of how Danish governance actually worked, they began to feel it. Not loudly, subtly at first. Papers moving through different hands. Recommendations approved faster than they should have been. Officials who had resisted certain directions found themselves eased from influence. Their positions maintained, while their actual function quietly hollowed out. Power had not disappeared, but it no longer moved through the channels it once had. What had begun as influence now took formal shape. Struensee's recommendations became decrees, signed in the king's name. Reforms came at a pace the court had never seen. Orders issued in rapid succession, reshaping law faster than institutions could fully respond. The abolition of torture as judicial punishment, the loosening of press censorship, restructuring of the tax system. What's striking, looking back at the record, is not just the content of the reforms, but the sheer speed. Somewhere in the region of 1,000 cabinet orders in under 2 years, the old guard wasn't just being outmaneuvered politically. They were being buried in paperwork. To the public, it looked like a government that had finally found its footing after years of instability. And this is where things started to shift in a different direction. Because institutions don't only notice policy, they notice process. Men who once shaped decisions found themselves waiting in corridors, consulted last, or not at all. They had kept their titles. They still received the formal gestures of deference, but they were no longer being asked what they thought. Before things were decided, they were being informed afterward. This is one of the crueler forms of displacement, to keep the appearance of position while losing its substance. Some adapted, and some found ways to remain useful within the new arrangements. Others grew quietly bitter. Bitterness, in a court, is not just an emotion. It is a resource, if you know how to recognize it. Juliana Maria recognized it. She did not create the resistance, but she gave it direction. She moved through the ordinary social mechanisms of court life. The dinner invitation accepted, the conversation extended, the sympathy offered to someone who felt passed over. She listened to grievances without explicitly endorsing them. She allowed people to feel heard, which is often what people need before they will consider acting. She let them draw their own conclusions, then asked the questions that confirmed those conclusions were correct. She was not building a conspiracy. She was cultivating an atmosphere, a shared sense, gradually thickening that something had gone wrong, that the arrangement now governing Denmark had moved beyond what any of them had agreed to, beyond what the rules of the system were designed to permit. Discomfort began to organize itself, not publicly, but in conversations that grew more deliberate, more connected. Caroline Matilda's role in all of this was different, but no less significant. She moved through public life as queen, visible in the ways a queen is required to be visible. Present at the events that required royal presence, composed in the ways a queen is required to be composed. This visibility was not incidental. It provided a kind of legitimacy, a social normalcy, for the changes happening beneath the surface. When the queen was present, things seemed ordered. When she endorsed, through manner, through composure, through the quiet authority of her bearing, arrangements that others might have questioned. Those arrangements seemed less like irregularities and more like the natural order of things. Her position had never been simple. She was caught between expectation, exclusion, and choices that carried consequences beyond herself. But she had moved from isolation into active engagement. She knew which courtiers could be relied upon. She had opinions about which appointments stood in the way of the reforms she and Struensee had discussed. She was no longer peripheral. She had become part of the structure. But here is what informal power can never escape. As it expands, it becomes visible, and as it becomes visible, it becomes vulnerable. Struensee had governed Denmark in ways that would have required hereditary legitimacy or a popular revolution to formally justify. And he had neither. He had access. He had the king's dependence. He had Caroline Matilda's trust and the institutional momentum of hundreds of reforms already embedded in the system. In little more than a year, decrees had come so quickly that even those who opposed him struggled to keep pace with the scale of change. These were powerful. They were not permanent. The moment people could name what he had become not a physician, not a favorite, but a de facto ruler. His lack of formal legitimacy stopped being a detail and became a weapon. Hidden power is most potent while it can deny its own shape. The moment it becomes legible, everything changes. What no one fully understood yet was how far Juliana's preparation had already gone. The fall, when it came, was fast, not clean. Fast. The same machinery that had enabled Struanzi's rise turned against him with equal efficiency, swift, controlled, and final. Arrest orders signed in the night. Doors opened before dawn. Names written onto documents by men who had spent months waiting for exactly this moment. Christian VII, whose signature had authorized so many of the changes Struensee had engineered, put that signature to different papers now. He did not fully understand what he was signing. He rarely had. That was the point. Struensee was arrested, tried, and executed. Caroline Matilda was removed from Denmark. Separated from her children, stripped of her position, sent into a foreign exile from which she never returned. She died young, not long after. The reforms she and Struensee had implemented were not all reversed. Some had taken too firm a route, had too many beneficiaries to simply undo, but the arrangement that had produced them was destroyed completely. Juliana Maria and her son moved into a governing position that would last for years. And then? Denmark moved on. But this is where the story becomes interesting in a different way. The version of events that circulated immediately afterward was built around scandal. A king who could not govern. A queen who had betrayed her marriage. A physician who had overreached. The framing turned it into a moral story. Transgression, punishment, order restored. That version was easier to tell. Scandal is comprehensible. It has recognizable violations and clear consequences, but scandal is rarely the whole truth. It is usually the surface that makes the whole truth easier to present. To some, Struensee was a reformer, a man who had genuinely tried to apply Enlightenment thinking to a real country. He had pushed through more substantial change in months than the previous generation of ministers had managed in decades. To others, he was a man who had moved too far, too fast, without the legitimacy to sustain it. Both of those things were true simultaneously. Historians who've studied the period closely tend to sit with that tension rather than resolve it. Figures like Ole Feldbæk, who spent decades working through the Danish archival record, have noted that the Struensee episode resists. It resists the tidy moral conclusions that contemporary accounts were so eager to impose on it. History has often found it easier to choose one version. The evidence doesn't cooperate. The same flattening happened to Caroline Matilda. Her position had never been simple, caught between expectation, exclusion, and choices that carried consequences beyond herself. She found connection and political purpose where the official structure had refused to offer her either. History reduced her primarily to the scandal, the queen who had an affair, whose removal was necessary, whose tragedy was personal. The structural questions her situation raised about what happens when capable people are systematically excluded from the systems that need them, those got buried under the more legible narrative. She remained a cautionary tale told in the language of morality rather than politics for generations. What remained wasn't the scandal, it was the system that had allowed it. The reforms Struensee had driven through did not disappear when he did. Many of them embedded themselves in Danish institutions and continued to shape how those institutions functioned, long after the political drama that had produced them was forgotten. Rights extended. Practices reformed. Ways of thinking about governance that had entered the conversation and could not be fully extracted even when they retreated temporarily from practice. This is the peculiar legacy of change driven through informal power. It cannot claim credit openly because the authority it uses is not technically its own. It cannot straightforwardly defend what it has built when formal structures reassert themselves. But what has already changed tends to resist full reversal. People adapt to new conditions. Institutions develop new routines. The old world gradually loses enough living memory to sustain itself. Juliana Morea's victory produced its own kind of distortion. She had been effective, genuinely, remarkably effective. She had outlasted a governing arrangement that had more access to formal power than she did, and she had done it without an army, without a title, without anything except intelligence. She had patience and a detailed understanding of how influence actually moves through social systems. But her methods were indirect. Her power was always exercised through others, through questions asked, and atmospheres cultivated, and conversations held without witnesses. The history that followed her victory struggled to fully account for her role in it. She was acknowledged as a participant in the restoration of legitimate order. She was rarely given credit for how decisively she had helped shape it. This is one of the most persistent patterns in how history records informal power. The decisions made in visible rooms, the arrests, the trials, the exiles, are documented. The decisions made in private rooms, the ones that made the visible decisions possible, tend to disappear. Informal power is careful not to write things down. By then, the power to govern no longer meaningfully rested with him. He is remembered primarily as a frame around the real story, the space within which everyone else acted, the authority that held its position while influence decided what it would do. The throne never moved, but it had already stopped deciding anything that mattered. What this court reveals is how quietly authority can be separated from control, and how difficult that separation is to see while it is happening. Authority is what the institution gives you. Influence is what you build with people. Authority can be revoked in a night. Influence lingers in ways that are much harder to undo. Struensee fell before dawn. His reforms took generations to fully trace. Caroline Matilda was expelled from the country she had helped govern. Her story continued to be told for centuries, though rarely accurately. Juliana Maria helped shape the outcome that defined the period. Then she receded into the background of the history she had made, as people who operate through suggestion and atmosphere tend to do. And Christian sat at the center of all of it, signing, authorizing, providing the formal legitimacy that each successive arrangement required. The throne still held authority, but it had already stopped deciding what that authority was for.